Welcome to Amazing AWS Architecture, where we dive into recent projects to discuss and diagram solutions for our customers. Today, we'll be exploring an ML-driven data pipeline that resulted in better data, improved logistics, and eliminated a number of manual tasks. But before we learn more about Decisive, I'd like to introduce you to Kenneth Henricks, one of the fine solutions architects at ClearScale. Kenneth, if you wouldn't mind, could you give a brief overview of ClearScale and your role at the company?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. My name's Kenneth Henricks. I'm a solutions architect for ClearScale. I've been here since March, but I'm no stranger to technology. I've been in and around technology for the last 2 decades, done everything from bare metal to browser. I'm excited to be here with ClearScale. They partner with companies to help them in their migrations and modernizations to the cloud. We're experts in a lot of areas and have 11 competencies through Amazon, which is really no joke. It's not just a badge we can download and put on a resume, but it's actually something that we had to work really hard to get. And there's a serious vetting process that Amazon goes through to make sure that we're legit. And they take a look at case studies and use cases that we've completed to make sure that we deserve the certifications that we have through them. So today I'm thrilled to bring you guys this case study through Decisive and share with you what we've done.
We're going to start with Kenneth going over who they are, what their initial challenges were, and then we'll explore the architected solution by the ClearScale team. Kenneth, it's all yours. Let's talk Decisive.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. All right, great. So Decisive, they're a customer that's in the service relationship management business. And so they have a platform for companies to use to keep track of service of fleets of vehicles, like commercial vehicles, for example. They had a lot of challenges in being able to get insights and derive value out of the data that they had. There were some data quality issues that stemmed from upstream processes and the way that their customers were using their platform. Everybody had adopted essentially their own strategy for how they would use the platform. Hardening the front end was going to be too disruptive. They weren't ready to put a lot of constraints on the front end and change the way the users were using the application. They wanted to do that more over time so that it was a little bit less disruptive for their end user community. And because of that, they wanted to focus on the actual data downstream, which is generally not the most ideal place to try to add value to data necessarily when you can constrain it upstream. But in this case, it made complete sense for those guys.
Got it. Thank you, Kenneth. Well, as you mentioned, today we're diving into one of the hottest trends and topics in the industry, which is AI and ML. Kenneth, let's start by discussing what exactly is artificial intelligence and machine learning. I think many of us default to thinking of Skynet, but that's not necessarily the case, right?
Sure. So, if you think about traditionally, logic in computers has been a series of if-then statements. It's certainly not as simplistic as that sounds on the surface, but that's really been it. Computers could only make the decisions that we programmed them to make specifically. And when you bring in the power of AI and ML, computers have the ability to mine data and look at trends and patterns so that they can learn what good, reasonable responses or answers are or inferences based on that data that it's fed. And a lot of times this data is very specific to an industry or a vertical or a specific business. And so the power of these AI and ML models are tuned specifically to specific businesses and for specific business cases. And so in this case here, we had an ML lifecycle pipeline that we built out to where we would start off with the customer being able to do their model development straight in something like SageMaker Studio notebooks. And so they would do their development and testing at this layer. And then when it came time to train the model, then they would kick into SageMaker training in order to get that data fed into their new models or the new versions of their models. Next up is the inference, which happens through SageMaker real-time inference. And this is where you ask the questions and ask the model to make predictions, and the inference comes back to whoever's asking the question. And while we didn't build this out during phase one of the project, a fast follow was going to be to use SageMaker Model Monitor to keep track of drift and bias. So sometimes we'll focus on the value of the model first, and then after the fact, tack on the model monitor after we have the model live, which is exactly the pattern that we followed here.
Got it. And so from what I'm seeing here, it actually reminds me of the software development lifecycle, or SDLC. Are those two actually roughly the same?
Yes, and that's a great question. It's actually a very interesting story. I watched this sort of evolve over time to where you had business intelligence groups and analytic groups that sort of evolved into data science groups. And those guys wanted to make lots of insights and inferences out of the data, but they didn't have a traditional training in engineering. And then you've got engineers that understand these SDLCs, but they don't really understand how to make insights out of the data. And so what happened is you have a lot of these data science type teams that are making changes straight in production. They don't have source control. They don't have versioning because they don't understand that it's not ingrained in their being like it would be an engineer. And so we saw those two realms sort of merge together and become what's called MLOps. And it's exactly what you describe. It's just a way to manage the SDLC so that as you're making changes and you're versioning these models, you can keep track and version control. You can do testing in non-production type environments and then deploy those changes into a production type environment when you're ready.
Perfect. So how did they actually use this pipeline then? Where did the data come from?
Yeah, well, we got the data from two key places, and I'll start off by talking about batch data. So batch data really can be any source. It can be a relational database, non-relational database. It can be just simply flat files or APIs from third parties, for example. But we would pipe that data in through Glue, and then the data would go through lake formation, where it lands into the data lake, data warehouses, and then ultimately gets fed into the ML lifecycle pipeline for further training.
Now, we only have one icon for AWS Glue, but from the sounds of it, that piece is actually going to do a lot of the heavy lifting, right?
Yes, good catch. Absolutely. And so Glue is taking care of several important things for us. First of all, it's crawling the data, looking for any changes in the metadata, for example, to update the data catalog. We've got some validation jobs going on to make sure that the data is at least decent quality when it comes in. We have some transformation in cases where we want to do some transformation to the data on its way in, and then also some formatting such as phone number stripping out hyphens and things like this.
Got it. So let's spend a moment talking about the lake formation piece. Is that actually a service?
Yeah, so it's a free service from Amazon that really helps you quickly get into your data lake. So over time, data lakes have evolved to where they started off as a bunch of S3 buckets full of flat files. Then they became a combination of modeled tables in something like Redshift, and now you have the best of everything. And people were having to manually manage those S3 buckets and the permissions. And using lake formation, you have the ability to easily ingest your data and also use like a GUI to go through and manage your permissions so that you're not trying to do that through a whole bunch of IAM policies, for example.
Got it. Got it. All right. So what exactly is going on with the API then?
Yep. So the API is the second main source of data that we had coming through here. And while a lot of the API data was requests, we were still getting some persisting data that was coming from the API. So if we walk through the use case here, we've got all the batch data that's come through, been transformed through Glue, and is being used to train these models. Now we have the end result needing to be queried through API. And so these API calls happen, and Lambda's making the translation, and it's going back to the ML model to get the inference about the data to try to answer or predict the question, right? And so this is where the inference is occurring. Now, once that inference is made, we saw value in historically preserving that. And so we were writing that back through a persistence layer into the data lake again. So now we have the batch data that comes in to train the model. We have a history of inferences that are made that we can also use to further train the model.
Man, this is great stuff, Kenneth. Let's actually talk about some of the business outcomes following implementing this solution.
Sure. So there was some really good business outcomes here. There's quite a bit on the screen here that we can read through here. But at a high level, what happened is that Decisive had increased confidence in their data, which actually increased the value of their data. We know that data is one of the most hot commodities today. And if your data is low quality or inaccessible, then it's not doing you any good. And so now they had data that was higher quality and providing value to their business. Now their machine learning muscles can grow further with their business and their industry. We have a very good firm pipeline set up for them and established. We can introduce new versions of the model that we built. We can introduce new models, for example. We have a good runway to start any future growth or development. They had a bunch of mundane work that is now automated, so people can focus on more rewarding and meaningful work. They're not focused on those mundane tasks of looking at data and taking hyphens out of phone numbers, for example. Yeah, and of course, last but not least is a flexible architectural foundation that they've been left with that opens that opens the way for future disruption. We know that in today's day and age that consumers largely command what businesses do and don't do. And there's a lot of change in what consumers want. And businesses that are able to pivot and adapt quickly are the ones that are going to not only survive, but also thrive in this industry. And we saw a lot of this disruption happen with the pandemic, where a lot of companies who couldn't or didn't pivot fast enough may not have done so well as those that were able to pivot and change, for example, by adding to their value proposition or evolving any of their existing value propositions. And so that's the vision that we like to use in any of these architectures that we employ. And that's certainly what we did for this customer. Now they have the luxury and the ability to let their business evolve at the speed of business, and their architecture has the ability to keep up by being componentized and by welcoming things like bolting new and existing functionality onto the system. So at ClearScale, we have several different AI ML offerings. We're happy to tailor anything to any business need, but we have some off-the-shelf type things as some ways to get started. We do have a quick one-day workshop where we can explore the value of AI and ML and what sorts of business problems that we may be able to leverage those technologies to solve with customers. Second, we have a week-long quick start that we can do a little bit more in-depth discovery and design session to where we get into some of the technical nuts and bolts. And then last here on the list, we have a 2+ month type track for a prototype or a proof of value focusing on the inference, where we don't really go through and do a lot of the automation just yet. So there's no MLOps pipeline, for example. We focus on making sure that we can solve business problems and we get the right value out of these models. And once we've proven that, then we can bolt on all of the automation and file off the sharp edges.
Man, really educational stuff, Kenneth. Greatly appreciate your time on this. I think that's actually going to wrap up today's edition of Amazing AWS Architecture. But certainly, if anyone is interested in learning more about how ClearScale can help their business, feel free to reach out by visiting clearscale.com, calling the number below, or emailing sales@clearscale.com. Until next time, thanks for watching.